Hi there, this is a special video that I'm doing here on the causes and effects of poverty and vagrancy in Tudor England and Wales. It's not normally the kind of topic that I cover in explaining history, but I'm going to make an exception this week due to popular demand. Okay, so there's exams coming up in the next few months on this very topic. So let's talk about causes first. Well, as far as causes go, there are several, but the one that really dwarfs everything else is a century-long population increase. In the 14th century, between 1348 and 1350, the Black Death killed a third of the population. In 2 years, 1 in every 3 people died. The Black Death returned 6 times throughout that century, and it decimates the population and results in all manner of upheavals. Throughout the 15th century, the population remains comparatively low, but generally begins to recover. And then in the 16th century, it starts to dramatically rise. So if you think about what social and economic conditions that would have created in the 15th and 16th centuries, it starts to make a very interesting picture of poverty and vagrancy. In the 15th century, if there were low peasant populations, so there are villages that are basically empty or abandoned, and the peasant population is sparse, this would mean that the pressure on land would be low. Land prices would be low. There are fewer peasants competing for large amounts of land, and so they, in the kind of the grand auction that is the economy, land prices don't go up and up and up. However, scarcity of labour puts economic power in the peasants' court. This means that landlords, because there is less land, and because there are less peasants, I beg your pardon, have to compete. They have to offer better wages for more scarce labour. Now, in the 16th century, there is this enormous population boom, and these processes go into reverse. Not only is there a kind of like a scramble for land, that not only are peasants more likely to demand scarcer and scarcer land, but also you have a problem of labour being more and more abundant. So the landlords, when they want farming work done or construction work done on their estates or ditches being dug, they're spoilt for choice. They can offer lower prices. So the peasants are hit in the 16th century by an unprecedented economic storm, largely caused by this long-term demographic rise. Now, that's the big cause, I'd say, but there are lesser exacerbating factors. For example, the issue of enclosure, which continues throughout the century. This is where commonly held land that is essentially shared by the peasants and mutually farmed by the peasants or used for shared grazing land, is enclosed by landlords. Landlords apply to Parliament for paperwork saying that the common land now belongs to them, and then they are able to evict tenants, throw them off the land into basic destitution, and leave them to their own devices. Enclosed land only makes up a small percentage, however, of the overall lands that are tilled or farmed. I think it is something like about 1.5%. So it's really fairly minor stuff. But it is, you can't see that as being an actual cause, but I would say it is an exacerbating factor. Similarly, when Henry VIII closes down the monasteries, something like about 20,000 beggars and vagrants who rely on the monasteries for their welfare. They're actually institutionalized. They live within the monastery. They are thrown out. The monks themselves and other members of monastic orders, they are, it's not a pleasant experience for them, but they have pensions for life, so they survive the worst of the kind of the crisis that besets the poor. Now, if you look at the writings of various Tudor administrators and diarists, they frequently remark upon the extraordinary nature of what they're seeing in terms of poverty and vagrancy. They look at it and say, well, there clearly is a very big and growing problem here, and there's a sense of bafflement about what to do about it. And if you think about about the nature of Tudor government at the time and about the nature of Tudor society, this makes sense. The administration would never have seen such a phenomena as unemployment or mass unemployment anyway, or inflation before. In the Middle Ages, you had basically a population sufficiently large or small, from you, depending on your perspective, sufficiently the right size for the amount of work that needed to be done, or the amount of work that there was in the economy to be done. You have for much of the Middle Ages, reasonably stable prices as well. Inflation, as we know, is the phenomena where prices start to rise at a higher rate than wages. And again, this is something that devastates the poor throughout the Tudor century. Again, this has mainly got to do with the massive increase in pressure on the land due to an unprecedented growth in population size. But it's also got to do with the huge influx of wealth that was pouring into Europe from South America onwards. The Spanish conquistadors, who were looting South America for its gold and silver, were pouring back into Europe large amounts of bullion, and this wound up overheating much of Europe's economy. So, and including indirectly the economy of England, which is intimately connected to the wider European economy through things like the wool trade and other businesses like that. So the big kind of macroeconomic view of this is that the Tudor century is hit by these unprecedented economic kind of crosswinds, and then things that Tudor governments don't particularly help. Now, because there's a widespread ignorance about poverty and vagrancy and its causes, the only way of looking at it is through a religious perspective, which is really how everything is conceived of in the 16th century. And also the remedies are therefore punitive. The hierarchical nature of society in the 16th century is divinely sanctioned. So God at the top has an order for everybody, and it is a static order. If you are a peasant, you are not really meant to be wandering around. You're meant to be being a good peasant in the fields where you have been put, and working out your purpose. Peasants that are detached from their immediate location and found wandering around are obviously sinning against the various poor laws and acts that are introduced from 1495 onwards. But also what they're doing is they're sinning against God. They are undermining the great chain of being. They're doing something both seditious and sacrilegious as well. It is something that God has not ordained. The fact that there's no kind of science of economics or sociology or any of the other things that sort of emerge in the early 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries means that the idea that there are other explanations for people's behaviour, there are other explanations for poverty and vagrancy. This is not a dominant idea if it's expressed at all. So, therefore, punishment for these transgressions is seen as entirely justified. There is no logical reason for a vagrant to be wandering away from his parish, and therefore, or if somebody is found quite simply wandering around without a master, then he must be punished, or she must be punished. Normally, he. The problem that parishes have is that some, particularly poorer ones, are overwhelmed by those applying for alms, ALMS, people living off the parish. One way of dealing with it is to periodically, when the Tudors have a war, is to ship those living off the parish off to war first. When the Lord Lieutenant of a county comes and says, the king has said that he needs an army of 10,000 men, true and brave, the parish, Derbyshire or Lancashire or wherever, might turn around to those who have been claiming the poor relief from the parish for long enough and say, well, it's you guys, I'm afraid, off you go. Tudor governments for most of the 16th century continued to punish vagrancy. There are distinctions made between poverty and vagrancy in the mid-century, where the idea of an able-bodied poor and a destitute poor emerge. There is some gradual understanding that throughout Edward and Elizabeth particularly, that the destitute poor, this is perhaps not of their own making, and licenses are granted for them to have the right to beg. The able-bodied poor, vagrants, are seen as kind of almost folk devils throughout the Tudor century. Thomas Cromwell writes extensively that what he believed that they seem to be motivated by the desire for looting and cheap drink wherever they go. The reality of this is probably quite different. The vagrants were poor peasants by and large, or the impoverished townspeople, who would partly look for work or begging opportunities, largely because where they come from is so poverty-stricken and so destitute, and they were not really forming kind of roving bands of thugs as was implied by Cromwell, but instead, huddled together for a bit of comfort and a bit of company and safety as well. The fear, which was really, I think, probably a hangover from the Black Death in the 14th century, of strangers coming to your town, particularly vagrants who would have been covered in all sorts of boils and sores and getting half-starved and emaciated. The fear was that they were going to bring disease. There was obviously a fear that they were going to be lawless or dishonest or violent. And there was also a fear that they just wouldn't go away, that once you start feeding them almost like a kind of a cat or something, that they're going to keep coming back, and that they would be a permanent problem and a drain on your parish that you would inherit in perpetuity. Hence the poor laws, which insisted on dumping them back where they'd come from. So strangers wandering into your village was never a kind of a happy occurrence, really. But as the century wore on, under the rule of the Protector Somerset, in 1547 and 1548, there's much more of a focus on the causes of poverty and vagrancy. During the rule of the Protector Somerset and Edward in general, prices continue to rise. There had been two very good harvests in 1547 and 1549, so it was there's a lot of confusion over why there are food shortages and why there's hunger. Nobody quite understands what could explain the difference between the price of grain and the price of other foodstuffs. Grain is particularly expensive. And there was a belief that the price of grain, surely this has got to do with the greed of traders and speculators. And there was a widespread knowledge that rents were rising rapidly, and this is obviously to do with the consequences of inflation. But inflation is almost kind of like an economic disease that people wouldn't understand the causes of real world diseases. Certainly, they didn't understand the causes of economic ones either. And the Privy Council issued regulations to control prices. They restrict exports, so you haven't got food flowing out of the country, pushing up the prices of grain within the country. And they introduce a thing called compulsory purveyance, which gives the king the right to buy provisions at fixed low prices for the poor. During the reign of Edward, one of the main causes of this new burst in inflation and subsequently poverty and vagrancy seems to be enclosure. Obviously, we have these big long-term factors, but this is an added exacerbating factor. And both Thomas Wolsey and Thomas More had their eye on enclosure. Thomas Wolsey had tried in the 1520s to have an investigation into the numbers of members of Parliament and lords who were enclosing land. Partly it was going to be a great stick to beat his political enemies with, but also he knew that if you create society make society sufficiently unstable, it's bad news for everybody. And basically Thomas Wolsey wasn't doing it out of the goodness of his own character, which there was precious little of that really. So there was a shift with enclosure when landlords were enclosing land, not only to fling the peasants off the land and make them homeless and hungry, but also to turn it from arable land where you're growing wheat and creating lots and lots of wheat so that prices of it are low, to making it pastoral land. You put sheep on it and sell them for wool and to some extent meat, and thus reduce the amount of grain in the economy, thus sending the prices up. So it was the triumph of the sheep over the plough. And the eviction of rural labourers obviously doesn't help. But if you were, one of the reasons for doing this is that if you were a gentry or a member of the nobility looking to make a lot of money in the 16th century, wool was how you did it. It was the kind of the ticket to riches of the time. So there was a huge incentive to do this. Most Tudor thinkers thought that the sheep were the cause of this, but it transpires really that this is just something that exacerbates an existing trend, and the existing trend really is the population rise. The Protector has an investigation in 1548 to discover how much land has been turned over to enclosure, and this is during a period of immense social turmoil and rebellion. And they come up with the answer that it is seemingly rather a lot. The gentry are dead opposed to the commission taking place, but Somerset decides that it's very, very important. The report gives a very accurate summation of how much land has been essentially stolen by the gentry and the social effects of this. And in 1549, Protector Somerset, against the entire will of the Privy Council, goes ahead and issues a proclamation enforcing legislation against the enclosure. And in July, he creates a second enclosure commission with powers to hear cases of grievances against the landlords. The rest of the council thought that this was going to be an incitement to uprising, and this is exactly what happens. There are rebellions all over the country in 1549. One interesting factor that perhaps doesn't get enough discussion is the ideological and religious changes that are happening throughout the 16th century when it comes to talking about poverty. A medieval, largely Catholic way of looking at poverty was that poverty is essentially a virtue. There are various things in the Bible about the innocence of the poor, about how Christ looks upon the poor as they are essentially children, and that they are not tainted by guile or greed, and that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, and all that kind of thing. And so the poor in the Middle Ages are, at least to some extent, viewed as the righteous poor, and that they are viewed as the benighted but beloved of the Lord, and poverty is not exactly a virtue, but certainly not a sin. But as Protestantism, particularly Puritanism, becomes dominant throughout the second half of the 16th century, poverty is seen in a very different light. Puritanism comes with all sorts of cultural values about work and the Protestant work ethic, and that if one is squandering one's talents, this is essentially a sin against God. And there's always a subtext amongst many of the Puritans who are abstain from drink or any sins of the flesh or anything like that, poverty is in some ways the cause of being caused by drink, and that as Thomas Cromwell writes, there seems to be this relationship between poverty and alcohol, or he alleges anyway. So poverty ceases to be seen as virtuous, and is seen as a sin, and it's kind of understandable that this religious, philosophical and cultural way of looking at the world was embraced by Puritan gentry. This is a generation of people who are, throughout the 16th century, becoming wealthier. They are engaging in mercantile trade, and they are part of a new early modern pre-capitalist economy that's emerging, that's kind of developing from the old medieval world that is based on land and agriculture. And these are people in the gentry, in some ways, are making more money and at a faster pace than the old nobility. And so any ideology that says that making money and accumulating wealth and accumulating property is actually a virtue is obviously going to be very pleasing to them and very attractive. And it feeds into a continued justification for punishing the poor throughout the 16th century. Okay, so throughout the next week or two, I'm going to try and put up a couple more of these videos that talk about this topic. So subscribe to this YouTube channel, stay tuned, and there will be more, and I'll be adding more stuff on Nazi Germany too. If you know of anyone that's going to find this useful, tweet it onto them, Facebook it onto them, and let's try and help everybody through this difficult exam season. All the best, guys. Thanks. Bye-bye.